In this episode, we move one step deeper into the attacker journey by focusing on privilege escalation, because gaining initial access is often only the beginning of a larger plan. Once attackers have any foothold in a cloud environment, their next logical goal is to increase their level of control, and cloud identity systems create distinctive pathways for doing exactly that. Privilege escalation in the cloud rarely looks like the traditional operating system exploits many learners imagine. Instead, it frequently involves policy misconfiguration, excessive permissions, and overlooked trust relationships. If you understand how cloud identity and policy systems are structured, you can recognize where escalation becomes possible. The purpose here is not to memorize obscure tricks, but to internalize the common patterns attackers rely on. When you see those patterns clearly, both defensive design and exam decision making become far more straightforward. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Cloud privilege escalation often begins with overly broad permissions granted to identities that were meant to be limited. In many environments, users or service accounts are given convenience access that includes actions beyond their actual job requirements. An attacker who compromises such an identity may discover that it can modify roles, attach policies, or create new credentials. These capabilities allow the attacker to transform a low-level compromise into a high-privilege foothold. Because cloud platforms centralize access control through identity and access management systems, even a single misscoped policy can have wide impact. This is why least privilege is not an abstract ideal, but a direct defense against escalation. One common pattern involves the ability to modify one's own permissions indirectly. For example, a compromised identity may not initially have full administrative access, but it might have permission to attach additional policies to itself or to create a new role with broader access. If identity governance does not strictly limit who can alter roles and policies, attackers can effectively grant themselves higher privileges without exploiting any software vulnerability. This type of escalation relies entirely on misconfiguration rather than code flaws. It illustrates how cloud privilege escalation is often about authorization logic rather than technical exploitation. Recognizing this pattern reinforces the need to tightly restrict policy modification rights. Another escalation pathway arises from trust relationships between roles or accounts. Cloud platforms frequently allow roles to assume other roles under certain conditions, enabling flexible cross-service or cross-account operations. If these trust policies are too permissive, a compromised identity might assume a more privileged role than originally intended. Attackers often enumerate available roles and evaluate which ones can be assumed based on their current permissions. When trust policies are loosely defined, the barrier to escalation shrinks significantly. Understanding this dynamic helps defenders carefully design and review role assumption boundaries. Service accounts and automation identities represent another fertile ground for privilege escalation. These identities often require broad permissions to perform deployment, monitoring, or orchestration tasks. If an attacker compromises a lower privileged identity that can interact with automation systems, they may pivot through those systems to gain higher access. For instance, the ability to modify deployment templates or pipeline configurations can indirectly introduce elevated privileges. Because automation is trusted to make changes at scale, compromising it can amplify impact quickly. This pattern highlights the need to protect not just user accounts, but also non-human identities. Permission inheritance is another feature of cloud identity systems that can enable escalation if not carefully managed. Organizational structures and account hierarchies often allow policies to cascade from higher levels to lower ones. If an attacker gains access at a level where inherited permissions are extensive, they may leverage those inherited rights to affect multiple resources. Conversely, poorly understood inheritance can hide overprivileged identities that defenders assume are restricted. Cloud identity models are powerful precisely because they are hierarchical, but that hierarchy requires disciplined oversight. When you understand inheritance, you better appreciate how privilege can expand unexpectedly. Temporary credentials and token issuance also create escalation opportunities if improperly controlled. Many cloud platforms issue short-lived credentials for specific operations, which improves security when implemented correctly. However, if the systems that generate or validate these tokens are misconfigured, attackers may obtain tokens with broader permissions than intended. Additionally, if token lifetimes are excessive or monitoring is weak, temporary access can effectively become long-term access. Attackers often search for ways to convert temporary footholds into sustained privilege. This underscores the importance of both strict token scope and strong auditing. Misconfigured conditional access policies can also open escalation paths. Conditional policies are designed to restrict access based on factors such as location, device, or time. If these conditions are poorly defined or inconsistently applied, attackers may bypass intended restrictions. For example, if certain sensitive actions are allowed without strong conditions, a compromised identity may exploit that gap. Cloud platforms provide rich policy options, but complexity can create blind spots. Recognizing that complexity itself is a risk helps defenders simplify and standardize where possible. Privilege escalation in the cloud is often quiet and administrative rather than noisy and exploit-driven. Attackers may not crash systems or trigger obvious alerts. Instead, they gradually expand access by manipulating policies and roles. This makes monitoring for privilege changes especially important. Sudden additions of administrative roles, creation of new high-privilege identities, or modification of trust policies are all signals that deserve attention. Without visibility into identity changes, escalation can proceed unnoticed. This reinforces the idea that identity logging is a cornerstone of cloud defense. Another escalation vector involves unused or legacy roles that retain broad permissions. Over time, organizations accumulate identities created for past projects or emergency situations. If these roles are not periodically reviewed and decommissioned, they can serve as hidden escalation targets. Attackers who enumerate the environment may discover dormant but powerful identities. Because these roles are often overlooked, their misuse may go undetected longer. Regular access reviews and cleanup directly reduce this form of latent risk. Cross-account access is a particularly important escalation consideration in multi-account cloud strategies. Organizations often link accounts for operational efficiency, but overly permissive cross-account roles can allow an attacker in one environment to pivot into another. If privilege boundaries between accounts are weak, a compromise in a development environment might escalate into production. Designing clear separation and minimizing unnecessary cross-account privileges is essential. This illustrates how architectural decisions influence escalation risk. Another subtle escalation pattern involves abusing resource-based policies. In addition to identity-based permissions, many cloud services allow permissions to be attached directly to resources. If these resource policies are overly broad, attackers may grant themselves access through indirect means. For example, modifying a resource policy to include a compromised identity can create an unexpected privilege path. Because identity and resource policies interact, defenders must consider both sides. Understanding these dual control planes is crucial for recognizing complex escalation routes. Ultimately, recognizing privilege escalation patterns unique to cloud identity and policy systems means accepting that cloud security is largely about managing authorization logic correctly. Attackers exploit mis-scoped policies, loose trust relationships, inherited permissions, automation identities, and cross-account links far more often than they exploit deep software flaws. When you internalize these patterns, you begin to view every permission grant and policy change as a potential escalation decision. On the exam, this mindset helps you identify which configuration creates unintended privilege growth and which control best prevents it. In real cloud environments, it encourages disciplined identity design, rigorous review, and strong monitoring. Privilege escalation is not magic. It is usually the predictable result of excessive or misunderstood permissions, and clarity around that fact is one of the strongest defenses you can build.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.